There are moments in a story when a single question changes everything. Not because the question proves anything, not because the answer is already known, but because once the question is asked, people begin looking at everything differently. For the Whittaker family, one of those questions emerged long after the videos had already gone viral, long after the road trips, long after the donations, long after viewers began treating the family like characters in a continuing internet drama. The question was simple. Why was Timmy alone? Not alone in the sense that nobody was around him, but alone in the sense that he was increasingly being separated from the people he had spent his entire life beside. His mother Lorraine, his relatives, his familiar routines, his familiar environment. The concern did not begin with accusations. It began with observations. Timmy Whittaker was not an ordinary internet personality. He was not someone who had built a channel. He was not someone who sought public attention. He was not someone who independently decided to become part of a social media story. Timmy became known because other people pointed cameras at him, and millions of people became fascinated by what they saw. At first, the public reaction focused on the family's living conditions. The poverty, the isolation, the unusual family history, the small house hidden away in rural West Virginia. But over time, attention shifted. People stopped focusing only on where Timmy lived. They started focusing on who had access to him, who was spending time with him, who was making decisions around him, and who was benefiting from his growing visibility. That shift matters because vulnerable adults occupy a unique position in society. They are legally adults, but depending on cognitive ability, communication limitations, and dependence needs, they can also require protections that go far beyond what most adults need. And that is where some observers began expressing discomfort. Not necessarily because they believed something criminal had happened, but because they believed certain boundaries appeared unusually loose. Videos began appearing showing Timmy traveling, Timmy leaving home, Timmy staying elsewhere, Timmy spending extended periods of time away from family members he had spent decades beside. To some viewers, that looked positive. For the first time, Timmy was seeing places he had never seen before. He was riding boats, visiting stores, traveling, eating in restaurants, experiencing parts of life that had never existed inside the small world he grew up in. Supporters looked at those moments and saw freedom, opportunity, joy, a chance for Timmy to experience a larger world. But critics saw something else. They saw separation, and separation raises questions, especially when the person involved is vulnerable. Because when a cognitively vulnerable adult suddenly becomes attached to new people, new environments, and new routines, it becomes important to ask who is making those decisions and why. One detail repeatedly surfaced in public discussions. Why was Timmy often traveling without Lorraine? For most of his life, Lorraine had been one of the central figures in his world. She was familiar, predictable, safe. Whether people agreed with the quality of care inside the Whittaker household or not, nobody disputed that Timmy's emotional attachment to his family was profound. That is why some viewers struggled to understand why outings increasingly seemed centered on Timmy alone. Why not bring Lorraine? Why not bring additional family members? Why create situations where Timmy was removed from the people he depended on most? Those questions grew louder as more footage appeared. Hotels, Airbnbs, road trips, private spaces, moments that some viewers saw as harmless and others viewed with increasing concern. And this is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable, because discussing vulnerability requires caution. Concern is not proof. Discomfort is not evidence. Suspicion is not confirmation. Those distinctions matter enormously, especially when real people are involved. But concern itself is not unreasonable. In fact, concern is exactly what safeguards vulnerable individuals are built upon. The entire concept of protective services exists because society recognizes that some people cannot always advocate fully for themselves, and many viewers began asking whether enough safeguards were actually present. The concerns intensified when public discussions began referencing legal issues connected to individuals who had interacted with the family. Again, allegations, rumors, public records, online claims, and verified legal findings are not the same thing. They must never be treated as identical. But once conversations about criminal histories, investigations, or legal controversies enter a story involving vulnerable adults, public scrutiny inevitably increases. And suddenly older videos begin being re-examined. Interactions that once seemed harmless are viewed differently. Jokes are interpreted differently. Behavior is analyzed differently. That is exactly what happened here. One clip that repeatedly resurfaced involved Timmy being taken through stores while others made comments some viewers considered inappropriate. Another showed playful conversations involving adult topics that critics felt were poorly suited for someone they believed possessed the emotional understanding of a child. Supporters dismissed these moments as harmless joking. Critics viewed them as examples of poor judgment, and that distinction became central to the debate. Because poor judgment is not the same as criminal conduct, but poor judgment around vulnerable people still matters a great deal, particularly when public trust is involved. One of the most controversial questions emerged from the Airbnb stays. Timmy was shown spending extended time away from home. Sleeping arrangements became part of public discussion. Viewers started asking questions. How long was he there? Who supervised him? What safeguards existed? What communication occurred with family members? What oversight existed? Those questions were rarely answered in ways that satisfied everyone. Instead, the debate intensified. Supporters argued that Timmy appeared happy. And to be fair, he often did. The videos showed smiles, excitement, laughter, moments of genuine enthusiasm, experiences he likely never imagined earlier in life. That reality cannot simply be ignored, because it is visible. But critics countered with a different observation. A vulnerable person appearing happy does not automatically mean every surrounding decision is appropriate. Children often appear happy during situations adults later recognize as problematic. The appearance of happiness alone cannot answer deeper questions about boundaries and responsibility. That distinction became one of the defining themes of the entire Whittaker controversy. What does care actually look like? Is it providing experiences, providing resources, providing entertainment, providing protection, or is it something else entirely? Because those goals can sometimes conflict with each other. And nowhere was that conflict more visible than in the story surrounding Timmy. The deeper people looked, the more they realized they were not simply debating internet content anymore. They were debating vulnerability itself. Who should have access to vulnerable adults? What level of oversight is appropriate? How much trust should families place in outsiders? How much trust should outsiders place in families? And what happens when nobody involved seems fully equipped to answer those questions? Those concerns would only intensify later, because by the time adult protective services entered the story, many people had already begun asking whether the Whittaker situation had evolved beyond the point where internet personalities, donors, content creators, and self-appointed helpers could safely manage it. The public debate was no longer about views. No longer about subscribers, no longer about road trips. It had become something much heavier, a question about whether vulnerable people were being protected, or whether everyone involved had become so focused on helping, documenting, rescuing, filming, or defending that they stopped noticing how fragile the situation had become. And according to many observers, that was the moment the Patrick questions stopped being about Patrick alone. They became questions about everyone who had access to Timmy Whittaker. and whether anyone was truly asking the difficult questions before the state eventually did. Comment below. Do you think public concern about Timmy's separation from family was reasonable? Or do you believe viewers were reading too much into situations they didn't fully understand? The deeper people looked into the Whittaker story, the less the debate seemed to revolve around a single person. That is what makes this chapter so difficult. Because the question was never really just about Patrick. And it was never really just about Timmy. The real question sitting underneath everything was whether the adults surrounding this family understood the responsibility that came with access. Access is a strange thing. Most people think of money as power, and money certainly matters. But when vulnerable people are involved, access can become even more powerful than money. Who gets to spend time with them? Who gets to influence them? Who gets to make plans for them? Who gets to decide where they go? Who gets to speak on their behalf? Who gets to tell their story? That is where the Whittaker situation became increasingly complicated. Because as the family's visibility exploded online, access itself became valuable. Millions of people knew who Timmy was. Thousands of people wanted to meet him. Hundreds wanted to help. Some wanted content. Some wanted attention. Some wanted to genuinely improve the family's life. And distinguishing between those motivations became harder with every passing month. One reason the public debate became so intense is because Timmy occupied a unique position inside the family. He was arguably the most recognizable member of the household. The person audiences connected with most strongly. The person viewers remembered. The person whose reactions, expressions, and personality became central to countless videos. That visibility created a strange dynamic. The more famous Timmy became, the more people wanted access to Timmy specifically. Not necessarily Lorraine. Not necessarily Ray. Not necessarily the family as a whole. Timmy. And that distinction matters. Because whenever one vulnerable individual becomes the primary focus of attention, the risk of imbalance grows. The story slowly stops being about a family and starts becoming about a personality, a symbol, a public figure, even if that person never asked to become one. That is why some observers became increasingly uncomfortable when Timmy appeared separated from his familiar support structure. Because support structures exist for a reason, especially for vulnerable adults. Routine matters. Familiarity matters. Trusted relationships matter. And abrupt changes can have consequences that outsiders may not fully understand. The internet often struggles with this concept because viewers see short clips, moments, highlights. They do not see entire days, entire weeks, entire emotional processes unfolding behind the scenes. A 5-minute video can create the illusion of complete understanding. But real life is always much larger than the footage people watch. Supporters frequently pointed to Timmy's visible happiness during trips and outings. Again, that observation deserves acknowledgement. Many videos showed genuine excitement. There were smiles that appeared authentic. Moments of laughter. Moments of discovery. Moments where Timmy seemed engaged in ways viewers had rarely seen before. Those moments resonated deeply because they suggested possibility. The possibility that Timmy's world could become larger than the small environment where he spent most of his life. And that is not an insignificant thing. Many people sincerely believed they were watching someone experience joy. But critics responded with a different question. What happens after the camera turns off? That question became increasingly important because visible happiness during an activity does not necessarily answer larger concerns about supervision, boundaries, or long-term well-being. Those issues exist independently of whether someone appears happy in a particular moment. That is why professional caregiving systems emphasize structure rather than emotional impressions. Because impressions can be misleading. Structure is easier to evaluate. Who was present? Who was responsible? What protections existed? What oversight existed? What documentation existed? Those questions became especially significant once allegations and controversies surrounding multiple people connected to the family began surfacing publicly. Again, allegations should never be treated as proven facts. But when serious concerns emerge around individuals who spend time with vulnerable people, public scrutiny naturally increases. And in the Whittaker story, scrutiny eventually expanded far beyond one individual. People started examining everything: the trips, the videos, the donations, the relationships, the decision-making, the family dynamics, the legal interventions. Nothing remained untouched. One reason the situation became so emotionally charged is because many viewers felt trapped between two fears. The first fear was neglect, the fear that the Whittakers had been living without adequate support for years. The fear that nobody was helping enough. The fear that vulnerable people were being overlooked. The second fear was exploitation. The fear that vulnerable people were becoming dependent on outsiders whose motivations remained unclear. The fear that attention itself could become harmful. The fear that helping and benefiting might become impossible to separate cleanly. Those fears pulled public opinion in opposite directions. Some viewers looked at the family and thought they needed intervention. Others looked at the same family and thought they needed privacy. And perhaps the most uncomfortable possibility is that both concerns contained elements of truth. Because intervention without boundaries can create harm, but so can isolation without support. The Whittaker family existed precisely at that intersection. One of the recurring themes emerging from public discussion was professional involvement. Many observers began asking a simple question: why were so many non-professionals carrying responsibilities that normally belong to trained systems? Social workers, case managers, guardians, medical professionals, protective services. Those structures exist because vulnerable individuals often require expertise beyond goodwill. Good intentions alone do not guarantee good outcomes. That lesson appears repeatedly throughout the Whittaker story. Many people likely cared. Some undoubtedly cared deeply. But caring and competence are not always the same thing. And vulnerable adults often need both. That reality became increasingly difficult to ignore as more details surfaced. The situation no longer looked like a simple story about helping a family. It looked like a patchwork system where various individuals attempted to solve problems they may not have been equipped to solve. Some focused on housing. Some focused on experiences. Some focused on donations. Some focused on protection. Some focused on publicity. But no single person appeared capable of addressing the entire situation. And eventually the consequences of that fragmentation became impossible to ignore. Adult protective services entered the picture. Investigations emerged. Family members were removed. Access changed. Communication changed. The entire structure surrounding the family transformed. At that point, the debate shifted dramatically. No longer should Timmy go on trips. No longer should people help the family. Instead, the questions became far more serious. Were vulnerable adults safe? Were appropriate safeguards in place? Had anyone properly evaluated the situation before it reached a crisis point? Those questions remain difficult because the public only sees fragments. Pieces, moments, statements, videos, claims, responses. No outsider possesses the complete picture, and that reality deserves humility. The strongest criticism many observers ultimately voiced was not directed at one individual. It was directed at the entire environment that developed around the Whittakers, an environment where vulnerable people became public figures, where strangers gained extraordinary access, where internet attention arrived faster than oversight, where good intentions mixed with personal interests, where helping sometimes became indistinguishable from participating, and where questions often arrived long after important decisions had already been made. By the time the state intervened, many people were no longer debating specific personalities. They were asking whether the entire situation had become unsustainable, whether too many people had become involved, whether too many boundaries had disappeared, whether too much responsibility had been carried by people operating without clear accountability. And perhaps that is why the Patrick discussion remains so emotionally charged today. Because regardless of what anyone believes happened or did not happen, it forced viewers to confront a larger issue. What level of protection should society demand when vulnerable adults become the center of public attention? That question extends far beyond the Whittaker family. It reaches into every situation where disability, poverty, internet fame, and dependency collide. And the answer remains far less clear than many people would like. Comment below. Do you think the biggest problem was specific individuals, or do you think the entire system surrounding the Whittaker family failed long before the state finally stepped in? The most important thing to understand about the Whittaker story is that by the time the public began asking difficult questions, the situation had already moved far beyond YouTube. That is where many people still get lost. They focus on clips. They focus on creators. They focus on arguments between personalities. But the moment adult protective services became involved, the story stopped being primarily about content. It became about risk. And risk is measured very differently than internet opinion. Protective agencies do not operate on the basis of whether someone appears nice on camera. They do not evaluate situations based on subscriber counts. They do not determine outcomes based on who uploaded the most emotional videos. They look at vulnerability, capability, supervision, environment, dependency, medical needs, access to resources, and perhaps most importantly, whether vulnerable individuals can safely advocate for themselves. That last point may be the most significant of all, because Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray occupied a unique position. They were not people who could easily sit down with investigators, lawyers, social workers, or judges and explain every detail of their circumstances. Communication itself was a challenge. And when communication becomes limited, responsibility shifts heavily onto the adults surrounding them. That is why the public debate surrounding Timmy's trips and separation from family members became so intense. Not because observers knew exactly what happened, but because uncertainty itself creates concern. Imagine two different situations. In the first, an independent adult decides to spend a week traveling with friends. Nobody questions it. Nobody worries. Nobody calls protective services. In the second, a vulnerable adult who relies heavily on family support spends extended periods away from familiar caregivers while becoming increasingly connected to outsiders. The facts may look similar on the surface, but the context changes everything. And context is exactly what made people uncomfortable. One recurring criticism centered on decision-making. Who was making decisions for Timmy? Was Timmy fully understanding those decisions? Was consent being interpreted correctly? Were family members fully informed? Were appropriate safeguards in place? These questions became impossible to ignore because Timmy's visibility had reached a level where almost every action involving him attracted public scrutiny. What began as curiosity gradually transformed into concern. Then concern transformed into investigation. Then investigation transformed into intervention. And once intervention begins, the conversation changes forever. That is why many observers now look backward and ask whether warning signs existed long before the removals occurred. Not necessarily warning signs of criminal behavior. Warning signs of instability. Because instability is often what protective systems respond to first. When multiple controversies emerge simultaneously, agencies begin examining the total environment rather than isolated incidents. Housing concerns, care concerns, family conflicts, medical issues, access issues, financial disputes, questions about supervision. questions about vulnerability. Each issue alone may not trigger intervention, but together they create a cumulative picture. And cumulative pictures matter. One of the reasons the Patrick discussion remains relevant is because it symbolizes a larger issue. Boundaries. Not legal boundaries alone. Human boundaries. The boundaries that normally exist between helpers and those receiving help. Between content creators and subjects. Between visitors and families. Between friendship and responsibility. Between access and authority. As the Whittaker story expanded, many of those boundaries appeared increasingly difficult to identify. That does not automatically mean wrongdoing occurred, but blurred boundaries often create confusion. And confusion is dangerous when vulnerable people are involved. Because confusion makes accountability harder. Who was responsible for what? Who should have intervened sooner? Who had authority? Who merely had influence? Who was acting as family? Who was acting as friend? Who was acting as advocate? The answers were rarely clear, and unclear systems often fail vulnerable individuals. Perhaps that is the most sobering lesson from the entire story. The public frequently searches for one person to blame because singular explanations are emotionally satisfying. But real-world failures are often systemic. Multiple small failures combine. Multiple people miss warning signs. Multiple institutions respond slowly. Multiple individuals believe someone else is handling the problem. And eventually vulnerability accumulates faster than protection. That possibility deserves serious consideration here. Because regardless of where someone stands on Patrick, Eric, Mark, Betty, Larry, or anyone else connected to the family, the final outcome remains difficult to ignore. 3 vulnerable family members were removed. That is not a small event. That is not internet drama. That is a profound intervention. And interventions of that magnitude generally occur because authorities believe risks have reached a level requiring action. The exact reasons may remain partially confidential. Certain details may never become public. But the outcome itself tells an important story. It tells us that the people responsible for evaluating the situation concluded that major changes were necessary. Whether everyone agrees with that conclusion is a separate question. But it happened. And once it happened, every earlier debate took on new significance. People began revisiting old footage, old interactions, old statements, old decisions. Not because those moments suddenly became proof of something, but because hindsight changes perception. Actions that once seemed ordinary are viewed differently after major events occur. That is human nature, and it explains why discussions surrounding Timmy continue long after the original videos disappeared from public attention. Because many viewers are still trying to understand where concern should have started. When should people have spoken up? When should boundaries have been enforced? When should professionals have become more involved? Those questions remain unresolved. Yet there is another side to this story that deserves acknowledgement. The danger of certainty. The internet often rewards certainty. People speak confidently. They present theories as facts. They treat suspicions as conclusions. But vulnerable families deserve more caution than that. Concern is appropriate. Questions are appropriate. Scrutiny is appropriate. But certainty without evidence can create its own form of harm, especially when real people are involved. That balance is difficult. Holding concern without rushing to conclusions. Remaining skeptical without becoming reckless. Recognizing vulnerability without assuming facts that have not been established. It is not an easy balance to maintain. And many public discussions fail to maintain it. The strongest conclusion that can be drawn is not necessarily about any individual person. It is about the environment. An environment where a deeply vulnerable family became one of the internet's most recognizable stories. An environment where attention arrived faster than safeguards. An environment where outsiders gained unprecedented access. An environment where good intentions, Personal interests, emotional attachments, and public curiosity collided in unpredictable ways. In an environment that ultimately proved incapable of protecting everyone involved. That may be why the story still resonates today. Because beneath every controversy sits a much larger question. What happens when vulnerable people become public entertainment before they become public responsibility? The Whittaker family may never fully answer that question, but their story forces people to confront it. And perhaps that is why discussions continue years later. Not because viewers are fascinated by controversy, but because they recognize something unsettling underneath it. The realization that vulnerability attracts attention. Attention attracts opportunity. Opportunity attracts influence. And without strong protections, influence can quickly become more powerful than anyone intended. Today, Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray remain largely outside public view. Many details remain unknown. Many questions remain unanswered. But perhaps the most important lesson is not about what happened after intervention. It is about what existed before intervention. Because by the time protective systems arrive, they are usually responding to problems that have been developing for much longer than most people realize. And that may be the real story hidden beneath every argument surrounding Patrick, Eric, and the Whittaker family. Not one decision, not one person, not one controversy, but a fragile system that remained fragile until it finally broke. Comment below. Looking back now, what do you think was the biggest warning sign that the Whittaker situation had become unsustainable long before the state stepped in?